Hello, everyone. It's John Laughland. I'm the director of Forum for Democracy International. Welcome to this week's forum. My co-host Peter Lavelle and I are immensely delighted and honored to welcome today two remarkably prominent commentators on international affairs, Glenn Diesen of the Greater Eurasia Project, an academic in Norway, and Ian Proud, a former British diplomat. And the subject of our talk this week is talking to Russia. Glenn, I was going to start the conversation with a rather silly metaphor. You know those pictures you see of ice on the North Pole fissuring and then collapsing slowly into the sea? I was going to use that metaphor to describe the European policy of not talking to Russia, cracking and then finally collapsing. I had that image in mind because there's been talk about talk now for some time. I'm sure you've followed this as closely as I have. I think it was a month or two ago, the Belgian Prime Minister Bart de Wever started to say, we're not going to be in this position of enmity with Russia for the next 100 years. Merz may have said something about it around the same time. And then Fernand Karteiser, a Luxembourg MEP, went to Moscow a couple of weeks ago and also referred to these talks, which were these discussions which were apparently being held within the European institutions about who should talk to Russia and so on. But if you look at the conclusions of the Foreign Affairs Council, which met on Monday, there's absolutely nothing about talking to Russia at all in those conclusions. The 27 member states sat around a table, their foreign ministers, and clearly there's not even any fissuring of the ice. What's your read, Glenn? Do you think there is any movement towards this or not?
Well, to extend on that analogy, a very slow movement like a glacier, I think you shouldn't expect to see much at all. First they've had this consensus on not talking to Russia, which was quite important in the beginning. And then, of course, now they're moving on a little bit, recognizing, well, we guess we do have to talk to them at some point, but who should represent us? Who should speak on our behalf? And then the next talk will have to be, well, what shall we actually demand? What is our common position, as the Europeans always say? And the common position will always be unifying under something extremely hawkish. So you'll probably end up in a strange situation where Kaja Kallas is sent to Moscow to demand the capitulation of Russia, build down its military. But this is kind of the problem as well with the EU. That is, if you have 27 member states with vastly different interests, security concerns, how exactly are you going to get a common foreign policy, security policy? And you don't. So this is why they usually have to frame all issues as, black or white, good and evil, because only by having everyone accepted the premise that everything was unprovoked, this is just Putin being the new Hitler, Russia wanted to restore the Soviet Union, only by framing it in this kind of way, you ensure that there's no dissent and you get everyone on board. I think that's why if you're going to move away from this very Manichaean view of the world, then there's no consensus anymore, and I think would break apart. So I don't think they're going to achieve anything at all.
No, I think you're probably right. I mean, it's noteworthy that the EU systematically refers, as it did, for instance, in these conclusions from Monday's Council, to Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, which is not a phrase that the American State Department uses anymore, oddly enough. Ian, you're a former British diplomat. You spent many years talking to the Russians in your capacity as a diplomat in Moscow. Even if they agreed, which, as Glenn says, is probably, they may or may not agree, but it's certainly not immediately on the horizon. What I'm struck by, if you look at Kaja Kallas's calendar, she, after all, is supposed to be the foreign policy chief of the European Union. It's striking she does very little foreign policy. She doesn't meet countries, leaders or representatives of third countries very often at all. The vast majority of her meetings are internal and self-referential to the European Union itself. Do you think that the European Union, even if it were to decide to talk to Moscow, is actually capable on a professional level as diplomats in having these kinds of discussions, Ian?
Well, also, John, on the tail end of that, I mean, are we right to assume that no one wants to actually to talk to her?
Yeah.
I mean, that's one conclusion you could draw, and that we've heard plenty of criticism of that. So that's the tail end of John's question. Go ahead, Ian.
Yeah, so I mean, you make an important distinction. You talk about foreign policy, and actually diplomacy is not foreign policy. Foreign policy is what you want to achieve. Diplomacy is the tool you use in order to advance that agenda, and in most cases meet somewhere in the middle with the person, you know, with whom you're negotiating, right? I mean, that's the difference. People tend to use the terms interchangeably. Is Kaja Kallas capable of diplomacy? No. Does she do foreign policy? Yes, actually, but she doesn't do diplomacy, and I think that's the important distinction to make here. Right back to 2014, there's been a progressive shift away from diplomacy to foreign policy via social media, where people in Brussels, but also, of course, in London, talk to people with whom they already agree, increasingly via social media channels in committee rooms in Brussels and elsewhere. This is not diplomacy. This is kind of a foreign policy echo chamber, and these are the unbreakable walls that Europe and Britain have trapped themselves, you know, within, and need to break out of. Now we know what their policy is: try and inflict a strategic defeat on Russia. Well, that's not possible. I mean, you know, diplomacy doesn't give them a way to achieve that foreign policy objective. Okay, so what would diplomacy serve to achieve? Diplomacy would serve to, you know, reach compromise, and actually compromise for the Europeans is failure, because if they compromise, they'll be seen to have compromised by the people to whom they've been talking via social media for the past 12 years that Russia is weak and will ultimately lose, and will have to admit that they got it wrong. So they need to think about what their foreign policy is, what they actually want to achieve from the war in Ukraine in a realistic way, and that they haven't done.
There also is recently, at least it's talked about a little bit more in the mainstream, is that whatever Trump's gambit was, or the spirit of Alaska, whatever that was, or even if it ever existed, there is a recognition that there is a withdrawal, or the Trump administration is openly showing that it's indifferent in many ways to Ukraine. And this gives, one would think, an opening for the Europeans to be able to save face after being stonewalling the Russians for this entire period, that they could move in and be the interlocutor that they had hoped the Trump administration would be. How important is that angle? A question to both of you. Glenn.
Well, it could be. I just don't see the Europeans filling America's shoes, because again, I'm not sure if Trump genuinely wanted to put an end to the war, or if it was just a process of outsourcing the war to the Europeans. Either way, I think that his strength, if you ask there maybe, was that he was able to break through some narratives. He was able to essentially say, listen, we've done some bad things too in the name, as Trump said, and
the killing has to stop. The killing
has to stop. And he heard Marco Rubio say the same thing. Will you condemn Russia? Blah blah blah. And he said, well, that's not a great point of departure, because if you start claiming that the other side is pure evil, then you're killing off the diplomacy. And I think this is where it's difficult for the Europeans, because since 2022. They all unified under this same narrative that this was unprovoked. Everyone had to repeat this, and I don't think this is accidental. By repeating there was unprovoked, it meant that there is no political solution, and any compromise is appeasement. And I think that's where they were going. That is, now suddenly, if we have diplomacy negotiations, this is a way of rewarding Putin. Instead, we have to elevate the cost by sending weapons, because everyone bought into this narrative. It's very difficult to have any sensible diplomacy with the Russians for the Europeans, because they can't give an inch without it being essentially appeasement in their eyes. I think the strength of Trump coming in was saying, listen, NATO did provoke this. He said it on at least 2 occasions. And by breaking that narrative, suddenly it has some room for maneuver to actually do proper diplomacy. So I'm not, I hope that the Europeans see this as an opportunity to at least fill the gap which is being vacated by the United States. But I don't have much trust in the Europeans.
Well, it it's certainly not being translated into an opportunity of Kaja Kallas is going to be the person that's going to be the point person here, or is this a Nixon go to China? I mean, of all people that could talk to the Russians, it could be Kaja Kallas. I think it's more comical than anything else.
Probably
but I mean,
the worst option there is.
Yeah,
but if I can just add one thing, I think, the fact that they boycotted diplomacy for 4 years now, they watched hundreds of thousands of young men die, and they did nothing. They didn't even want to pick up a phone. I mean, this is vile on so many levels, but they framed it as a moral stance. And I think this kind of mentality is why I think it's difficult for them to now reach out and actually do proper diplomacy.
Yeah, but Ian,
I think,
let me just go to Ian real quick here. I mean, the fact that some people are saying that it's time to talk to the Russians, Ian, does that mean the current policy, as amorphous as it is in many ways, the European policy a failure?
Well, I think the policy is very clear. It's also clear that the policy is a failure. So I agree with you. I mean, the policy has been clear. It's just been completely unrealistic to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia. And now circumstances have emerged in which the policy, including use of economic warfare through sanctions, is becoming increasingly unsustainable in the teeth of an even greater oil price, rise and economic depression that will flow from that, caused by the war in Iran. So that puts even greater pressure on the policy. So the policy is clear. It's just that the policy is a failure. And because it's a failure, there's no diplomacy, because diplomacy would reveal it to be a failure. Do you see what I mean? I mean, that is the key point here.
I think one of the things which this whole discussion throws up is, of course, the dysfunctionality of the European Union, because under normal circumstances, there should be no discussion about who should negotiate. We have a high representative. She is responsible for foreign policy. And instead, perhaps instinctively, people immediately started to cast around for other people to put in her place, in Kaja Kallas's place. Should it be the president of Cyprus, which currently holds the council presidency, for example? Should it be Gerhard Schröder, whatever? The fact that the person whose office was created for precisely this kind of negotiation is, as it were, automatically ruled out, shows the dysfunctionality. Another aspect, which again is linked, in my opinion, to the dysfunctionality, is that in parallel to all this, and indeed against it, is the European Union and the Council of Europe's support for the creation of a special tribunal to prosecute Russia, to prosecute presumably Russian officials, and presumably the most senior ones, for the crime of aggression. This is a EU Council of Europe Ukraine initiative, which most people would say is incompatible with the very notion of a peace negotiation. If on the one hand you're talking to someone, and on the other hand you're expecting to arrest them the next minute. This seems to me to be a Ian, you say the policy is clear. Yes, it is clear. And what's clear is that there is institutionally no chance of peace if these other institutional procedures go ahead.
Well, that's absolutely right. I mean, European foreign policy is geared up to avoid the possibility of peace and kick the can down the road by saying, well, there will be war by 2030 or 2027 or some other year. But the policy never changes, or the policy just becomes more, extreme. And if there were diplomacy, then, the Europeans would have to talk to the Russians about the policy, including the policy of having a special tribunal against Russia, which Russia would never agree to in any peace deal. So therefore, there's no diplomacy, because that is an unachievable foreign policy goal. Therefore, the foreign policy, is completely, redundant to the realities of the circumstances in Ukraine itself. And actually, this whole discussion reveals the fact that in all these discussions of what the Europeans and what the Americans are doing, Ukraine yet again is just another pawn, in this game. And to briefly touch on the point about sort of Trump, I mean, I actually think there was the contours of a more realistic foreign policy by the US administration, but it crashed against the monolithic European policy which refuses to budge and shows absolutely no sign of changing, and for that reason rules out the possibility of peace anytime soon until Europe either runs out of money and or Ukraine runs out of bussified men.
Yeah. So in other words, your view is that the Americans came up against the immovable brick wall of the Europeans. That's your reading of it.
Yes.
Yeah. Glenn, you're in Scandinavia. How do you understand Alexander Stubb? Because I think I've forgotten to mention him in the list of people who have called for talks, because he, of course, is extremely hawkish on Russia, but is very pro-Trump. Is he angling for the job himself? Is he trying to imitate Trump? How do you see his game? Because he's one of the people who surprisingly called for talks with Russia. Glenn.
Yeah, again, it's hard to assess what this actually means. I think I'm a bit skeptical, to say the least. I mean, as you said, he's quite hawkish. So my interpretation was, well, what you were hinting towards, that he simply wants to position himself as the guy who knows how to reach out to the Russians, the one who can talk to them, a little bit like Macron is trying to position himself as well. But also beg the question, his whole comment that it's time to talk to Russia. You know, one has to ask, well, why now? Why was it not time 4 years ago when he was, very much against it? What has happened besides, Ukraine losing hundreds of thousands of men, its infrastructure and its territory? So there's no good reason why suddenly now was this good time. So that means that either you have to recognize that you made a mistake or that you're losing on the battlefield and now have to walk things back. And I don't think they're going to do any of this. So no, I think it's going to remain hawkish. I think it's the same reason why Kaja Kallas wants to represent the EU in Moscow. And she was very clear why she wanted to. She said, well, I know Russia's tricks. I will make sure we don't walk into a trap. So in other words, she's just going to prevent any serious talk from taking place. And some of this goes back to also what the Belgian prime minister said, because he was making the point, if we put an end to this war, we have to restore relations with Russia, something that was considered to be controversial to say, because, if you end the war, you want to put it properly to bed, be done with it and start over. But people don't want this. And I think this is also reflected in what kind of peace they want. And again, that's another thing. Once we agree who should represent Europe, what the conditions are, do they actually want an end to the conflict with Russia? Because when they speak of ceasefire, what they're communicating is, well, we're not quite ready to give up. We need to regroup and rearm, and we can continue this a different day. But no one's actually talking about the need to seriously reconsider what has caused the breakdown in the European security architecture. Indeed, they're even talking now about setting up a new European bloc without the US.
Yes.
This is quite crazy. Like what caused this war to begin with was the fact that we reverted to the logic of the Cold War and the bloc politics after the Cold War by expanding NATO. This seems like an opportunity to rectify this mistake and go back to the ideas behind the Charter of Paris for a New Europe in 1990 about an inclusive security architecture based on indivisible security. Yeah. Instead, their plan is to set up a new bloc, but this time without American protection and including Ukraine, just to make sure a war with Russia is guaranteed. It doesn't make much sense. So,
there's, we're part of a very unique and I would think special club that actually thinks about indivisibility of security, something that was so commonly talked about decades ago. It's a very common phrase to use, and when we use it, people think it's a Putin talking point. Gentlemen, I think we're forgetting the second part of the equation here. Why would Russia engage any envoy at this point? Why would they be interested in it?
Who do you want me to take that first? I mean,
go ahead.
I think President Putin is, and actually Lavrov. I mean, Lavrov is a very, very seasoned diplomat. I mean, they will talk to anybody. Whether they get agreement is another matter, of course. I mean, I think I've never got the impression.
Yeah, but I mean,
let me finish, Peter.
Okay. Sorry.
I've never got the impression that they would refuse to talk to people. I mean, quite the opposite. There's been a complete refusal to talk to them. I don't believe for a minute that if there's a proposal by Stubb or Macron or somebody like that, or heaven forbid Keir Starmer, although he probably wouldn't have a job for that much longer, that they would say no. In fact, I'm quite confident that they would say yes. Whether they secured agreement is quite another matter. They probably wouldn't in the first instance. But so, I mean, I've always kind of felt that actually the Russians are far more astute diplomats, frankly, than we are. And I think the door's open and they would, hold talks, but whether or not they achieve anything.
But I think there's a distinction between talks and engaging in negotiations. I mean, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner come and chew up a lot of time, but the Russians don't take them very seriously. No, they don't take them seriously at all. Okay, the Russians are very polite. I agree with you, Ian. They will talk to people, but there's going to be no expectation that it's meaningful in any way. It's meaningful. It's a pleasantry to Donald Trump that Putin took his time, Lavrov takes his time, and others. But I think there's an important distinction between, yes, talks and negotiations. And to be honest with you, if Kaja Kallas is the person that's going to be appointed, well, she won't be welcomed here. I don't think she would be welcome. We already know what she wants to talk about, okay? And it would be an affront. It would be a diplomatic affront to do that.
I think the other obstacle is surely the fact that there's no, again, Ian, you say the policy is clear. Yes, the policy is clear. If I don't know, a wish list, I wish I were a millionaire, that's a clear policy, if you like, or at least a clear wish. In reality, though, Europe is, and Ukraine, and I want to bring Ukraine into this discussion because the Ukrainian foreign minister took part in the Foreign Affairs Council meeting on Monday. Ukraine, Zelensky, as I understand, has said that he wants to talk to Putin. On the other hand, as if you've seen Julia Mendel's interview with Tucker Carlson, she very rightly identifies the fact that Zelensky and the Ukrainians, and the Europeans, by the way, are all over the place. They say one thing and then they do another. They talk out of both sides of their mouths. What agency do we attribute to the Ukrainians in this? I mean, if tomorrow they really did say, right, the game is up, we've got to talk, would that then bring about change?
Well, the thing is, I mean, we're talking about, the kind of the back end of the process. We're talking about the kind of point where, the principals going to meet the principals and they talk. But actually, the whole thing, and to agree with Peter on the negotiations point, which is actually separate from the talks in one distinct aspect, there needs to be a whole process of negotiation about, what the treaty language would look like in any peace deal. I know the Russians are expecting that. The Russian ambassador to London has told me that himself. That process would take months. They are the negotiations. These happen at a technical level long before Kaja Kallas flounces into, Vnukovo Airport. So it's that thing that's missing. And of course, that is that hard diplomatic yards that reveals the inadequacy of the policy, because policy is just a wish list. It's the things that you want to achieve. It doesn't mean that you can achieve it. And actually, the negotiations are the bit where you kind of go through the Russians' wish list and the Ukrainians' wish list and the Europeans, and you try and find something that you can put down on paper that reflects something that everybody can agree to in terms of a peace deal. That's going to take months, long before anybody turns up in Moscow. And okay, they could go along.
Right,
and
it looks like we're having okay, Ian.
That they could have preparatory kind of talks, but it's those negotiations that really need to happen. And there's no sign really on the European side that they've really thought about how to approach that side of the process.
Glenn, what do you think? Is this the self-licking ice cream? Both Ukraine and Europe and ultimately the United States all want the war to continue, and therefore everybody is engaged in a sort of vicious cycle.
Well, it could be. Again, I think for the United States, the ideal situation could be simply to outsource the war to the Europeans, because as long as this goes on, the Europeans will be obedient to Washington and the Russians will be weakened. I think a key goal for the US will be not to alienate the Russians, but at the moment they get to play the good cop. Nothing substantial has really changed that much in US foreign policy. I mean, this is still Trump following, providing weapons, providing the intelligence. Well, to be fair, he's not providing it for free anymore to the same extent. So there are some changes, but But they definitely want the war to continue. I think the Europeans are also, they can't really imagine any other solution which doesn't entail the defeat of Russia. And I think, again, when we say Ukraine, which Ukrainians exactly, I think if it was up to the public, they would have wanted, a peaceful, negotiations to end in a settlement already. But I think for Zelensky, once there's peace, I think he's done for. He's over. And I don't think the nationalists would allow him to sign anything that resembles a peace agreement either. So it's very difficult to envision what this peace will look like. But also, as Ian was talking about, this whole process of coming up with the same language. Because if you listen to the Europeans talk, this is a war about the Russian aggression, the Russians wanting to expand an empire. So they have one framing to find the solutions. The Russians keep talking about the root causes. When they talk about the root causes, that's they're referring to what they've been talking about for the past 30 plus years, which is the European security architecture. We're supposed to have a security architecture as we signed and agreed in 1990-94, based on an inclusive Europe, one without dividing lines, one based on indivisible security and sovereign equality. And I think this is something the Europeans do not wish to discuss. This essentially represents the permanent split from the unipolar moment and shifting over to the multipolar. And so I think that's why they're willing to, again, risk so much as well. So, no, that's why there should have been diplomacy over the past 4 years, even if they hadn't sat down and gone into the heavy negotiations, at least have some common language and understanding of how each side views this.
Well, I mean, the fact that there's been some calls for some kind of special envoy representing the EU, is this a result of the inability of NATO to act as a military alliance in unison? I mean, is this a substitute for it? And what is the fate of NATO, considering the indifference or relative indifference of the Trump administration, and the fact that many European leaders or the leadership of the EU are talking about a direct war with Russia in 2030? Where does NATO fall into that, or if at all? Yeah, either one.
So, I mean, I've been talking for a long time now about the fact that, the EU is drifting away from, its roots towards becoming a political and military bloc, almost like NATO Mark II, something that Glenn referred to, which would render NATO redundant. Doesn't mean it necessarily cease to exist, like the Western European Union and things like that. These mechanisms, I've discussed this with John before, have a habit of sticking around long after they become redundant. So, I mean, NATO is a bureaucracy. I mean, I see very little signs that it will cease to exist. The Americans make a lot of profit out of it. But I mean, the risk in terms of European security long term is that actually the EU itself drifts into a political and military alliance, which is completely against any possibility of a normalized relationship with Russia, and which has some awkward incorporation arrangement with Ukraine in the future, which simply, presses the pause button on a much bigger general war with Russia at some point in the future. I mean, that is the big risk. That is one of the reasons why, some Europeans are worried about admitting Ukraine into the EU, in addition to the fact they'll lose lots of their subsidies if that were to happen on equal terms. So EU becoming NATO Mark II is the big risk that we face right now.
Yeah, but surely that's a very good point, and I wanted to come on to that anyway. I can't see anything in the Foreign Affairs Council conclusions about EU membership for Ukraine, but we all know it's supposed to be being fast-tracked. At least people say that. Whether or not it's realistic, again, as Glenn has said a couple of times already, it's very difficult to read the runes. We don't know what's really going on. But it certainly seems to be on the agenda. Now, surely that would be the straw that breaks the camel's back. Even Poland, for God's sake, has got reservations about Ukrainian integration into the EU. Glenn, go ahead.
Well, no, well, I just want to say before as well that this whole new geopolitical EU, the militarized EU, I think it's a failed proposition to begin with, because what gave some sense to the European Union was for the EU to be a geoeconomic project. That is, it facilitated the collective bargaining powers of all these 27 countries. They could then deliver clear, tangible economic benefits for countries. In other words, why would you outsource part of your sovereignty to Brussels? Well, it's because in return you got something more valuable back. I think the problem of shifting now over to geopolitical Europe is that it first of all, it relies on making an enemy out of Russia, and once you do this, there's no more cheap energy and reliable energy resources. There's no huge Russian markets waiting for you, and you will see the European economies begin to stagnate, decline. The Americans can take advantage of a more divided Europe in conflict. The Americans, as we see, are also extracting concessions out of the Europeans. So Europe becomes very weak as a geopolitical project. Yes. And also, what is it actually based on? Confronting Russia? This is not the Soviet Union, and I think it does make any sense. It's not a real suggestion, and it kind of takes me back a bit to the beginning of the 90s, because we argue that during the Cold War the role of NATO was to deter the Soviet Union. Fair enough. After the Cold War, NATO became a project for collective hegemony, but it was always implicit or implied to the Russians that you can either accept this dominant role of NATO or you can resist it, but then you will be considered counter-civilizational actor, and we will then go back to our Cold War mission of containing you. And I think now that we have conflict with the Russians, the Europeans just assumed, okay, we're not going to have this project where we manage Russia's decline, but now we will go back to the Cold War format of containing Russia. The problem is that we're in a multipolar world. The Americans have better things to do. If they put their too heavy presence in Europe, it consumes the resources, it pushes the Russians towards the Chinese, so they don't want to do it. Well, if the Europeans aren't going to make an enemy out of Russia, what is it that unites them? I mean, the Greek, the Irish, the Latvian, what kind of security policy do they have in common? So it's not going to sustain itself. It's going to fall apart. And when it falls apart, the EU will have thrown away the most important thing that kept it together, which was its geoeconomic purpose and value, which is now already dead, I would say.
Yeah. What is the role? We have Frederick Merz coming out with some very, at least historically thinking, disturbing statements about Germany. I'm paraphrasing here, of course. Is the protector, the defender of Europe. Well, all of us are steeped in recent European history. I don't need to mention the obvious here, but is that a way for this European NATO 2.0? Is that going to be the basis of it? And how can you find consensus in the EU for such a proposition?
Well, I think it's going to be difficult because
I hope so.
to agree completely with what Glenn said, it steps away from the geoeconomic purpose of the EU in its founding. And what did that deliver? That delivered peace, because it didn't talk about war. It didn't talk about militarization. It talked about opening up. It talked about human connection. It talked about trade and those sorts of things. There was, in its original inception, there's no kind of political baggage. We didn't have to all have the same values to kind of sell stuff to each other and go on holidays in each other's countries. We could all go to each other's singing contests without being judged and that sort of thing. And it's morphed into something that it wasn't intended to be. And I think that is a problem. So when Germany, which wants to have the biggest army in Europe by 2039, we should all be worried about that, quite frankly.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Is there a natural propensity in modern Europe for Germany to lead? Is that irresistible? I mean, you get that sense from some politicians in Germany.
No, I think at the moment the hatred and I would argue the mass hysteria among the European political elites means their hatred of Russia is it helps to obscure some of the problems behind this. But if you go to countries like Poland again, they irrespective of vast amounts of Russophobia, they're also not too comfortable with Germany rebuilding or building the most powerful army in Europe. So and anyways, it's not really sustainable. This is not the Germany of the 90s either who would build this large military. This new Germany is the Germany who just backed the genocide in Gaza. It's the Germany who said that the Israelis were doing our dirty work in the attack on Iran. It's the Germany who has generals on TV, grinning and applauding as they saw German tanks rolling into Kursk. This is, who wants to now send making long-range missiles to strike Russian cities. Who's clamping down on free speech, considering banning the largest party in Germany. I mean, it's a very different Germany we see emerging. So as they continue also in economic difficulties, political instability, social instability is I think we've all seen this movie before. I don't think the Europeans would welcome this, and I think it's very difficult for the Germans to achieve as well, because you can't simply say one day, oh, well, guess we don't have this heavy industry anymore, or the chemical industry will just start building tanks, prepare for going to war with Russia. It's not a very sustainable economic model. So no, I have my doubts that this can be achieved.
I think we should recall as well that this is quite an old goal. We were talking about wish lists a few moments ago. When Ursula von der Leyen was German defense minister, she already then, so we're going back now before 2019, I think it was in 2017, she said she wanted Germany to have, I can't remember how many hundreds of thousands of soldiers and to become the largest army. So this is, I think, yet another example of Europe's illusions, Europe duping itself with these targets. I mean, let's not forget, the European Union does this all the time. It produced, if I'm remember correctly, in 2000, a report about its own economy saying by 2010 it would be this and that. And then when that didn't happen in 2010, it produced one saying it would do it by 2020 and so on. It's always generating these reports, these projects and so on. And they really don't bear much relationship to reality. Ian.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, there's a wider question too, isn't there? About do young people really want to see their future in the army?
Exactly.
I mean, we have a massive recruitment crisis in the UK.
Yeah.
Can you? We've seen how people are recruited in Ukraine into the military, and it's not a very happy sight that seldom gets reported. Men over 43 now are not allowed to leave Germany for more than 6 months at a time without registering, with a ministry there. There's increasing talk about conscription, here in the UK. Young people have grown up in an era of peace and relative prosperity. I mean, frankly, not that prosperous, but it's certainly better than it was in the 20th century. People don't pin their futures on going to fight and seeing their mates having their legs and their heads blown off, next to them for decisions that people in Westminster made and didn't consult them on. I mean, I think most young people just want to kind of look towards the future, embrace people from different countries, want peace, and so on. So, I mean, there's a question about whether Germany could have an army that big anyway. I don't believe that the UK could, based on, what's happening right now.
Yeah.
But that's a good point, though. With people often refer to the globalists, and that's one term of using. But you can't really deny that the political elites these days have become very denationalized. They're not really pushing. Well, the nation state appears to be outdated for them often. They've been, I would argue, suppressing nationalism, tradition, faith for so long, and developing all these alternative values. So, not to be crude, but it doesn't. I don't think that people are willing to go and fight and die essentially for the LGBT flag. I think the nationalism of the past, which they help to suppress and replace with things which aren't really sustainable. I think this will undermine the ability to fight, and that's just the ability to build these armies. I think also within the West, there was always a need for a internal balance of power. First of all, without the Americans, we have a big problem because the US, they were always are pacifier. You already see some arguments. The French don't want to buy British weapons because they're not in the EU. The Germans would like to have to develop their own arms bases, so that they don't outsource too much of the decision to Brussels. So you will already see dividing lines emerging. And even if it was only the European Union, you always had a bit of a balance of power there too. The French were the military wing, the Germans had the economic, so they had the distribution of power. The British had a bit of both. Now the British are gone. The French military is weakening. The Germans are now going to dominate militarily. I mean, it's I think under all this language of values, they ignore that there's an actual recipe you need for an internal balance of power within, even within an alliance, in order for it to work. And I think all of this being disrupted very, very quickly.
That's one huge wish list. Okay, gentlemen, considering the rhetoric that has been coming out of Europe or the European elites with the advent of this conflict in Ukraine, and rearmament and conscription, should Russia be preparing for, or is it preparing for a war with the EU or European EU by 2030?
Well, I think in answer to that question, I mean, if you tell somebody you're preparing to fight them by 2030, then they're going to prepare themselves to defend themselves in that eventuality, which in itself shows the absurdity of the European position. It's like saying, well, I'm not ready to fight you now, but maybe I could book you in for 4 years' time and we could organize it then. I mean, it's just a completely absurd, just a completely absurd thing to say. We don't have enough money to fight you at the moment. But we're going to build up our money. We're going to bussify our kids. And, can we book in a date maybe in June of 2030? And, of course, the Russians are going to respond in kind, obviously, to that. And they're going to prepare themselves for that possibility. Although my firm belief remains that actually Russia wants to have a normalized relationship with Europe, partly as a balance to China. I mean, Russia has very good relations with China, but that's also a strategic threat too in some regards. But it has to do it on the basis of respect and actually real agreement, real diplomacy. And that's the thing that the Europeans have been singularly unable to deliver thus far. And it isn't just 4 years, it's actually 12 years. I have to keep reminding people, certainly for the UK, there has been no diplomacy for 12 years, actually, on the UK side.
Yeah. Glenn,
Ian, point out, Ian, since you lived here,
it's all my fault.
Well, the next time you're here with your wife, my wife and I will take you out for a wonderful steak dinner. But I would advise you just to walk through one of the main grocery stores in Moscow, and you will notice the number or the increase of Chinese goods on an everyday basis. It is really, and John can attest to this, electric cars, they're everywhere, and they're all Chinese. Okay, so I'm just kind of reacting to your point about I know
it's just about balance. I was thinking really more than of course China is very obviously a natural trading partner with Russia, has for very, very obvious reasons. But I do very much look forward to my next visit to Azbuka Vakuza.
But I mean, so is Europe is a natural trading partner for Russia.
Yes,
Glenn, I just want to bounce back on something you said. You said the British are out, or you used a phrase like that.
Oh, I meant of the European Union, which means that the internal balance. Yeah, but they might go back.
As you well know, one of the perverse consequences of Brexit is that Britain has tried to big itself up even more than before, particularly over the Ukraine thing, in order, as it were, to compensate for Brexit. So Britain is very much, I would say, part of the military equation. If we're talking about a military confrontation, Britain will be in. Britain is in all these ad hoc groups, the G3, the G5, the B8 is the latest one. As far as I know, Britain is in all of these anti-Russian coalition, European anti-Russian coalitions.
But the thing is, John, our army, it hasn't been this small since 1823, when our population was 4 times smaller. Our Navy hasn't been this small since just after the end of the English Civil War. So, I mean, I don't wish to kind of demean them in any way, because my dad was in the army. I've got a great respect for anybody who serves their country in the military. Let's be completely clear about that. But it took us 3 weeks to send one ship to Cyprus, and that to be repaired 3 times en route. I contend, as I have many times, that it would take, a wooden ship of the line, a much quicker time to get to Cyprus than HMS Dragon. But
yeah.
Well, I agree. I think Europe, we've been living under the American protection now for so many decades that we allowed ourselves to not just create excessive economic dependence, but which has a problem as well, but also we didn't develop our own proper military capabilities. But that doesn't mean there's not efforts to overcompensate and essentially provoke war. And that's one of my concerns now. I actually think we're heading towards an all-out war now with Russia, not because we can win, but just because, as things go south on the front lines, the Europeans now, they have to find a way of compensating. That is to make sure that things don't fall apart in Ukraine, and that solution is to escalate, which is why you see these drones, deep strikes against Russia. And there's no more doubt that the Europeans are very much involved in the attacks on Russia. So this is happening, and so it's creating a lot of pressure on Russia to restore its deterrence by hitting back somehow, like the Iranians did. And as these tensions grow, the Americans are essentially saying, "Well, okay, we're out. We're going to hand this over to you." So, which removes the last sliver of deterrence for the Russians. Why they shouldn't? I mean, why would the Russians allow for their deterrence to be stepped all over now? It doesn't make any sense. So I think that's considered to be a huge threat by the Russians. If your enemies don't fear you anymore, they don't, as the Europeans say, the Russians don't have a nuclear deterrent, they have nuclear blackmail, and it would be immoral and dangerous to respect it, they say. So this is, I think the Russians they think that they have to do something. So I think we're heading somewhere.
This is something you've warned about a lot, Glenn, in your various ex-posts, and I'm very, very attentive to what you say. What you're essentially saying is that the pressure is rising on Russia to make some sort of military strike within the territory of the European Union and NATO.
Former President Dmitry Medvedev, he posted, I think it was only today on Twitter, he said, "Congratulations to Russia's friends. We now successfully tested the Sarmat strategic missile system." So,
we're closer.
We're closer. Yeah, and this is not hot air. It's just recognize what are the main security threat to Russia now. If you have an adversary like the Europeans who think they can just launch missiles into your cities and claim, "Oh no, we're just helping Ukraine. We will never let this war end, and as long as it goes on, we can just strike your cities and call it pretend it's Ukrainian." They can't stand for this. So at some point, it becomes more dangerous to do nothing than to do something.
Exactly. That's the Karaganov argument.
Yes. Yeah, well, it was also actually in December of 2021, the former CI director for Russia analysis, George Briby, he gave an interview to Radio Free Europe, and he was making the same point that the Americans were entrenching themselves so heavily in Ukraine now that it was now more dangerous for inaction by the Russians was more dangerous than action. So in other words, if you do nothing, the Americans will never leave Ukraine. They will build up heavy missile presence, and things will be very dangerous. So
that was Putin's argument for the invasion of February 2022. He famously has said, hasn't he, several times, when a fight, he said, I learned on the streets of Leningrad that if a fight is inevitable, you better be the one who strikes first. And according to that logic, the pressure should surely rise to strike first, as it were, in Europe. Ian, you're closer, I think, to government circles than any of us. At least I'm not close to any. Do you think this possibility has dawned on anyone in Whitehall or anywhere else in NATO?
No. I mean, I think the Overton window is so small that people are locked into into this kind of narrative that actually we just have to keep boiling the frog. I had an army officer actually say that to me once when I gave them a sort of briefing about Russia. Well, I hear what you say. In other words, I don't really agree, but we just need to keep boiling the frog. I think there's a real kind of delusion, in Whitehall. You look at the UK national security, paper of last year. Totally delusional in terms of its global scope. We are a middle power now, a regional kind of, military power. That there has yet to be a change of thinking. And I think that's partly because of the velocity of change at ministerial and prime ministerial level, and that velocity may be sort of continuing as we speak. And of course, that gives power to the state itself. The people who are permanently in charge, the Chatham Houses, the Roosies that troll me from time to time, the kind of the mainstream media, all of whom are infiltrated by the intelligence services, of the UK. There's a whole ecosystem that ministers aren't really able easily to imprint any kind of new policy direction on top of, because they're never around long enough to do so. So for that reason, I see little sign of change at the top. Every now and again, I hear squeaks about it from the MOD, nothing from the Foreign Office at all, I'm afraid to say.
But Glenn, that will only strengthen the voices in Russia,
exactly,
who say, as Karaganov does and others, that these people don't understand what's going on, and therefore we need to teach them.
Yes. No, and again, that's the direction I think we're going. Again, I'm sitting in Norway now, and in this country during the Cold War, they had essentially a security maximizing position. They said, okay, we'll join NATO because we need the deterrence. However, we will not have any bases on our soil and have no American or British activity in the high north because that would be provocative. So in other words, you want to reduce the threat to the opponent, but at the same time show deterrence. So they attempted to maximize this on both sides without triggering a security dilemma. These days, you have headlines in the papers. Norway is going to be one of the leading drone manufacturers. So Norwegian drones will be killing Russians, and this is not a shameful statement. This is like out of pride almost. So it's very this aggression, and I don't understand how it makes sense, because it does look crazy, and it does seem like if the Russians think, well, this is a huge danger, we let our deterrence slip. Well, that makes a lot of sense to me, because if you see a country like this with 5 million people bragging in the headlines how they're killing Russians, how they're going to be leading the manufacturing of missiles and drones to fight against the Russians, and Russia would never do anything because, no good reason at all. You can't help but to reach the conclusion that the deterrence of Russia has now been severely reduced. No one would ever think about making this kind of statements during the Cold War, for example. So, no, exactly.
The Euro missiles crisis broke out in the mid-'80s for that very reason.
No, so I think this is why we're heading down, I think, a very dangerous path. I think we're running out of time when the Russians will put up with this. Every time you're having this celebration in the European media that, look, all these refineries in Russia burning. I don't, they're essentially celebrating bringing the war to Russia. I don't think that they fully appreciate that. At the same time, they're making sure that this war will now be brought to Europe. And once that happens, there's no escalation control anymore. Not on the Russian side either. This can spiral out of control in a big way. And this is the only reason, I think, why the Russians haven't done it yet, because they always saw a dilemma. Either we retaliate, but then we risk World War III, or we don't retaliate, but then we'll embolden NATO to further escalate. And I think it's gone as far as it can. And but again, warning against this in Europe is considered to be a treason. You can't. We have abandoned, our common sense. It's. And
at the same time, and I'm sure all of you are aware of it, but there means some very prominent geopolitical thinkers here in Moscow. Essentially, the gauntlet is being thrown down, and as Glenn has rightly pointed out, I mean, we have to teach the West what deterrence means, because they flaunt it We take it seriously. They don't, and they have to be put back in order. That is an escalation. And I can tell you, gentlemen, the general population wants something like that. Okay, you can feel it. You can feel it, particularly how is so widely reported here, obviously, about what Iran has done to American bases in the Gulf, and even taxi drivers say, we should do something like that. I mean, it's gotten down to that level where people are, there is fatigue of the war here. That's obvious. Okay. One thing I want to ask you, maybe this is just irrelevant, but Glenn, I see you every single day on Twitter. Okay. I like your stuff and comment on it here. There's a real spike over the last couple of weeks of just this whole bot ecosystem just pounding away at Russia and supporting Kaya Kallas and all of the. Does that mean anything to you, or is it just I'm paying too close attention and I should get off Twitter?
No, I'm not sure to be honest. I think there's they notice that the mood is changing, that is things are going poorly on the front lines. The people are losing a bit interest. I think the fact that the Iran war also took a lot of attention away from Ukraine. I think this is something that's considered to be a problem. So no, I think now the big things they have to sell is, the war is actually now turning to Ukraine's favor. The Russians are having more losses than ever before, and a lot of news stories yet again that Putin might be dying. People have been following Russia. I've read these stories for 20 years now. Yeah. Every time there's tensions with the West, Putin develops a new disease, it seems. Yeah. So you have all these stories coming out now, and so you can see that the media is being worked to essentially revive the interest in continuing this war.
Ian, last words. Do you share Glenn's pessimistic outlook? Do you share his belief that some sort of literal physical military conflict, some sort of military attack by Russia within Western Europe is on the cards, or perhaps even inevitable, or at least likely?
No, I don't. I mean, that's one of a very small number of areas where I might slightly depart from Glenn. That doesn't mean I don't think an escalation is possible, but for the time being, I think that'd be possible within the curtilage of Ukraine itself. Using Oreshnik style or even kind of more powerful weapons like that, possibly even on the border with Poland. I think once you strike Europe, you're striking NATO, and that takes into a whole different territory. It really depends on. I know I was briefly talking to Fyodor Lukyanov earlier today, and he was saying that kind of the scale of these these Ukrainian drone strikes is ramping up now, quite significantly. That could be a bit of a game changer, but for now, I think actually, Russia may well escalate. But for the now, I think it's going to escalate within Ukraine itself. I do think there's scope for significant military escalation on the Russian side, but I don't currently assess that being against a NATO country at this time. But let's see.
We have one more minute, and I'd like to ask a question of both our guests here. Is Article 5 getting wobbly?
I think it always has been. I mean, do you think? Let me give you a hypothetical.
60 seconds. Go ahead.
If Montenegro was invaded, do you think France is going to rush to their aid? I'm just saying. I mean, it always has been wobbly.
No, what I'm obviously getting at is the American reaction. Glenn, what do you think?
No, I don't think. I think it's become much weaker. But of course, people always read maybe too much into Article 5. If you read it, it actually argues that if one state is attacked, something along the lines, then others can consider it, to be an attack as well, and they can respond in any way they see fit, including the use of military force. So it doesn't compel the states to send in the army. But I think the Americans have communicated. Ambiguously, but that they will not join in, and so no, I think this is I'm doubtful at least now whether or not they would go all the way, but yeah, nonetheless, it's a very
It doesn't
dangerous
bode
time.
well for European security, does it? At all?
No,
Well,
and
I mean,
that's like
none of this bodes well for European security, frankly, and it hasn't done since 2014. But this kind of really kind of lack of policy thinking, total disengagement from diplomacy, and this kind of delusion and shift to kind of empire building through social media. I mean, it's all been a complete failure, and the biggest kind of failure is that nobody in Brussels and nobody in London currently appears to be able to see this.
Yeah. Well, maybe if they watch the Greater Eurasia podcast and the Peacemonger podcast, that might change. So I can only encourage both of our immensely wonderful guests to carry on, as I'm sure they will do their good work. And we look forward to having both of you back on the forum whenever you like. Thanks to everyone for listening, and see you next week. Goodbye.
Thank you.